Hey, little buddies, it's Uncle Rick from the Uncle Rick Audiobook Club, where you and I enjoy reading great books together. On today's podcast, I'll be reading a chapter or two from one of the exciting books in the club. I hope you enjoy it. Stick around at the end of the podcast, and I'll tell you how you can listen to the whole book, as well as tons of others that you are going to love.
A Visit with Uncle Rick, a podcast by Rick Boyer of Uncle Rick Audios.
Chapter 2, Join the Cavalry. If you want to have a good time, ran the rollicking Civil War song, join the cavalry. And the lively lines went on from there, often to the accompaniment of a mounted banjo player. It was not all fun or fury at first for John Mosby. In the Washington Mounted Rifles, as his company was called, his captain was a hard-drilling and loud-cursing old army man named William E. Jones. He had graduated from West Point and fought Indians on the plains. Along the way, as he fought, he had acquired the appropriate nickname of Grumble Jones. He had retired from the army before the war. Now, scorning military trappings, he came to the service of Virginia wearing blue jeans and a hickory shirt. The insignia of his rank was carelessly sewn on the shoulders of his old homespun coat. There was nothing slipshod, however, about the way in which he drilled his cavalry recruits. In the camp in western Virginia, on the march to Richmond, and in the crowded Confederate capital, slim, sandy-haired Mosby won Grumble's regard. John was proud of the cheers the company received. He was prouder still when Captain Jones growled his good opinion of him. In the poorly armed Virginia forces, the captain managed to get 6 of the best short cavalry guns called Sharp's carbines. They would kill at 1,000 yards, John wrote his wife, Pauline. Jones picked the men who got the guns. John was one of them. "I'll always put these men in front," said the gruff officer. "I shall always place them in the post of greatest danger." That was where John wanted to be. He saw little action, however, in the Shenandoah Valley, where the company was sent to serve under the dashing Colonel James E.B. Stewart, whose initials gave him the nickname Jeb. Plain Grumble Jones called Stewart a whippersnapper. But to John, who was a little younger than Stewart, the colonel seemed just the kind of soldier he wanted to be. There was nothing homespun about Stewart's dress. Big and bearded, Jeb Stewart rode gaily to war with a dark plume waving on his hat. He wore white buckskin gauntlets. Over his trim uniform, his gray cavalry cloak was lined with scarlet. On his polished boots were little spurs of gold. He always rode the best horses, and rode them so hard that even the best did not last long under his saddle. Even with tough Grumble and dashing Jeb, John saw little action then. As a young soldier and later as a veteran, he was critical of General Joseph E. Johnston, who took over the command in the area from General Thomas J. Jackson. John did not like it when Johnston retreated and gave up Harper's Ferry. It was a strategic area in which he was to see more action later. But John cheered with other eager soldiers when the order came to hurry eastward. Beyond rivers and mountains, the war's first big battle was shaping up below Washington at Manassas Junction and along a creek called Bull Run. And I've crossed that very creek, so I know where they're talking about. "On to Richmond," the North was shouting, and it looked very much as if the Yankees could carry out that threat. From Washington, politicians and ladies and picnickers rode out in carriages to watch the big Union army end the rebellion quickly. But the Rebs had help coming. Stewart left a few cavalrymen to bluff big Union forces in the Shenandoah Valley. The rest of the Confederates, under Johnston and Jackson and Stewart, hurried east. Grumble Jones put John at the head of his squadron when it marched 60 miles in 2 days. At Bull Run, Jackson stood like a stone wall and won that great nickname. Henceforth he was known as Stonewall Jackson. The confident Yankees were halted, pushed back, and then driven in headlong retreat back to Washington. The South exulted as if it had won the war. John Mosby played little part in the victory. As one of the 6 with the carbines, he was sent forward to look for a lurking enemy. The expected force was not there. Then John and the men with him were pulled back into the reserve, where they stayed. Grumble Jones was furious when the general above him did not pursue the retreating Yanks, and John was so disappointed that when after the battle he wrote his Pauline, he exaggerated his part in, quote, "a perfect storm of shot and shell," unquote. He had not even been where he could see the front line fighting. John's first injury was an accident. One night on sentinel duty, he mistook galloping Confederate horsemen for Union cavalry. He fired. The only damage done was that his own horse took fright, whirled out of control, and threw John. He was knocked unconscious. Grumble grumbled, but John was up and ready for more. Later he was surprised and delighted when Jeb Stuart picked him at random with 3 other men to go on a scout. This time Stuart cautioned him about quick shooting. He had a better chance with his carbine when he and a friend, Fountain Beatty, who was to become one of his rangers, met and fought 2 Yankees in a wood. Still, as the months passed, action along the front was so quiet that in January 1862, Grumble Jones gave John a 6-day furlough. When he came back, things began to happen. On February 12, while on picket duty, he watched Stuart, now a general, in his plumed hat and red-lined cape, ride into the town of Fairfax Courthouse, followed by an empty carriage. Then, to John's surprise, he was detailed to travel in the carriage with ladies who were retiring to safer quarters behind the front. More surprising still, when he returned after dark in a snowfall, Stuart told him to stay at his quarters that night. The hospitality troubled John more than danger. Dressed as any common soldier, he was acutely embarrassed in the presence of Stuart and his staff, while they sat before a blazing fire and talked unguardedly at dinner and at breakfast. "I do not think I raised my eyes from my plate, although they chatted freely," John said. But, he added, "So here began my friendship for Stuart, which lasted as long as he lived." Stuart apparently knew more about John than John thought. The common soldier had scarcely reached his camp before Grumble Jones, who had just been made a colonel under Stuart, asked John to be adjutant of the regiment. "I was as much astonished," the suddenly commissioned adjutant wrote, "as I had been the night before to be asked to sit at the table with the generals." He did not like the position very much, however. Ceremonials bored him. Military forms and regulations irked him. When he conducted his first dress parade, he was more frightened than in any fight in which he was ever engaged. He was eager to find more exciting duty than that of a ceremonial adjutant. He found it. As spring came on in 1862, the high hopes of a quick Southern victory, which had followed Bull Run, were gone. On the day in February that John became adjutant of the 1st Virginia Cavalry, the Confederates took a bad licking at Fort Donelson in Tennessee from a Yankee general named Ulysses S. Grant. In April, the Union Navy captured New Orleans. At Shiloh, Southerners learned bloodily that the Yanks could and would fight. Now in Virginia, new greater Union forces moved under General George B. McClellan, hailed as the Young Napoleon. General Joseph Eggleston Johnston drew the Confederate forces back toward the Rappahannock River, but McClellan was also moving an army down the Potomac, where he could come up the peninsula between the York and James rivers and take Richmond from the east. It was not clear where the main Federal force was or where McClellan meant to hit his hardest blow. Stuart, in command of Johnston's rear guard, put the 1st Virginia Cavalry in position to meet a Yankee attack from the north. The handsome Jeb peered through his field glasses at threatening Yankee troops. "General Johnston," he said to those about him, including Grumble Jones and his adjutant, "wants to know if McClellan's army is trailing us or whether this is just a feint." Slim John Mosby perked up. He had among his comrades an almost comic reputation for wanting to be first with the news. Somehow he got newspapers from the Yankee side of the line before anyone else did. Getting the news first, one officer said, was his ruling passion. Now he spoke up. "Give me a guide," he said to Stuart, "and I'll find out for you." Jeb Stuart looked for a moment at the young sandy-haired officer. Then he promptly gave the adjutant a guide who knew the roads in the neighborhood. With the guide and 2 other soldiers, John set out around the flank of the enemy column before them. He reached its rear while the Yanks were advancing in a noisy show of strength toward the Rappahannock. And behind the Yanks, as they began shelling the Confederates, John found out what Generals Stuart and Johnston wanted to know. The Yankees were making a lot of noise, but they were only a small force with no line of communication with Washington. They were masking some other Federal movement. With the news, John rode nearly all night back to Stuart. Then, as he approached the Southern forces, a Reb picket stopped him. He covered the returning scout with his gun. For a moment, it appeared that John would have to go back or get shot by a fellow Confederate. Finally, he persuaded the Reb sentinel to let him pass. He galloped to Stuart, who was momentarily expecting an all-out enemy attempt to cross the Rappahannock. Breathlessly, John told the plumed Confederate commander that the only force before him was a curtain of Yankee cavalry which had been left to cover the retreat of most Federals from that field. Stuart hesitated no longer. He hurried his men toward the bluffing Yankees. The muddy, weary Mosby galloped beside him. "You can have any reward you want," the general shouted to John. No reward came, though Stuart did put John's name for the first time into the Confederate records. Quote, "Adjutant Mosby of the 1st Virginia Cavalry volunteered to perform the most hazardous service and accomplished it in the most satisfactory and creditable manner." Unquote. He added that John was worthy of promotion and should be rewarded. Instead, John lost the rank he had. Under a foolish provision of the conscription law just passed by the Confederate Congress, soldiers were allowed to elect their own officers. John described it as, quote, "an attempt to mix democracy with military discipline," unquote. In the 1st Virginia Cavalry, the men rejected their colonel, tough old Grumble Jones, and picked in his place Lieutenant Colonel Fitzhugh Lee, an able soldier, but one John Mosby never liked. John thought this Lee arrogant and humorless. Once, jokingly in Southwest Virginia dialect, he reported to Lee in Colonel Jones's absence, "Colonel Lahorn was blowed for dress parade." Lee flared, "If I ever hear you call that bugle Lahorn, I will put you under arrest." John saluted, but was angry inside. So when Fitz Lee became colonel, he did not care to serve under him as adjutant. Also, he thought any colonel should pick his own adjutant. He promptly offered his resignation. Lee accepted it. John lost his post and his commission. Perhaps not all the fault was Fitz Lee's. John then, according to one who knew him well, was, quote, "a rather slouchy rider who did not seem to take any interest in his military duties." This was in April 1862, exactly a year after John rode off to war after joining the cavalry. It was a bad time for the Confederacy as well for John. General Johnston was steadily falling back, knowing certainly now that McClellan was preparing to strike on the peninsula between the York and James rivers. Finally, he reached the point where McClellan's Yanks were about 5 miles from Richmond, along the sluggish, swampy Chickahominy River. There Johnston fought in the Battle of Fair Oaks, or Seven Pines. The battle was indecisive, but the important result was that Johnston was wounded and Robert E. Lee succeeded to command. General Lee did not consider retreat. With Richmond close behind him, only attack would serve. He studied where to strike. The new commander had a hunch that McClellan's right flank stretching westward was unguarded. He needed to be sure and turned to Stuart to get the information. Stuart knew the man to seek it. He invited Mosby, grown less timid about eating with officers, to breakfast. Stuart had given John a place as a scout without commission on his staff after he ceased to be adjutant of his regiment, and John had rejoiced in the change of jobs. It brought him, he thought, under the orders of a man of genius, and saved him from being an adjutant forever. Stuart showed his faith in John. "I want you to have a look at McClellan for me," the general said. John nodded. "Take a small party, the smaller the better, and see what he's doing along Totopotomoy Creek. General Lee wants to know if he's fortifying his right." Within the hour, as a man without a post or a commission, John set out toward the creek along McClellan's right flank. He took only 4 men with him. They made a good start, then ran into trouble. Yankee cavalry discovered them and chased hot on their heels. Still, Mosby found out enough to convince him that for miles McClellan's flank was only guarded by cavalry pickets. Through the woods and swamps, John hurried back to Stuart. The cavalry leader was sitting in the yard before his headquarters. The weary Mosby lay down in the grass beside the general to tell what he had discovered. "A martinet would have ordered me to stand in his presence," the scout said later, perhaps thinking of Fitzhugh Lee. Stuart listened to his story. John had not been able to get through the Union outposts, but he was sure a larger force could. He traced with his finger the route which he believed could be followed to cut through the screen of the Yankee forces. "There's nothing to stop you," he said. Jeb Stuart was excited. He told John to go to the adjutant's office and put down the route and plan on paper. John brought his report back, but Stuart noticed that it was unsigned. He ordered Mosby to sign it. Then, thrusting the paper into his pocket, he set off at a gallop for General Lee's headquarters. Stuart came back with orders from Lee to go the way John had shown was open. Stuart was in high spirits. John was beside the lively, elegant general when he set out with 1,200 picked officers and men from the 1st, 4th, and 9th Virginia Cavalries and the Jeff Davis Legion. They had 2 light guns of the Stuart Horse Artillery. Off in the bright dawn on June 12th they trotted toward Ashland. An officer at the camp asked Stuart when he would be back. "It may be for years," the general said merrily. "It may be forever." John rode ahead. He had not had so much fun since he had joined the cavalry.
Thanks for listening to A Visit with Uncle Rick today, little buddies. That's all we have time for right now. But remember, the whole book is available on the Uncle Rick Audio Book Club at unclerickaudios.com. Why not ask Mom and Dad about joining my club today?